Hey there, my name is Jasmine Sky and I'm here today with another video, another one about my MFA program and my experience with my MFA, whether or not my MFA was worth it, which is a big question because a lot of MFAs cost money, especially if you don't go to a fully funded MFA program wherein you get a teaching assistantship or grant or something like that. Especially if you write sci-fi, fantasy, or any genre fiction, it is very, very hard to get fully funded in the MFA realm. So I, like most people, had to pay for my MFA, and I therefore spent quite a lot of money. And was that worth it? Was it worth it to spend money on a 2-year MFA experience? I'm going to talk about that in this video. 2 for 2 so far. I have been in boy mode every time I have wanted to talk about my MFA, so don't know what that's about, but here I am. Yes. I talked a little bit about this in my explaining graduate degrees in creative writing video, and I also think I talked a little bit about it in my Surviving the Query Trenches video, but I have an MFA in creative writing from the Stone Coast program, which is through the University of Southern Maine. It is a low residency program. It is a top tier low residency program, specifically very well known and very good at its popular fiction program, which is what I got my degree in. If any of those terms don't make sense to you and you want to learn more, I'm going to link my explaining graduate degrees in creative writing video below so that you can have that primer. But for this, I'm just going to talk about me, my experience, and whether or not it was worth it for me, which the short answer is yes. It was very much worth it for me. I loved my MFA experience. I would go back and do it again if I could. It was amazing. I really hope to continue to be able to interact with that community and maybe go back as a TA or something like that in the future. We'll see what's in the cards. But it was really, really good. Those 2 years were some of the best, especially in terms of the actual work I was doing for my MFA and the residencies that I went to. Since it was a low-res program, those residencies were the best days of my life. They were spectacular and they will always be very fond memories for me. And I learned a lot. So much. I learned so much in my MFA program. And I've had other experiences to learn creative writing critically as well. I had a capstone course in college. I took creative writing in high school for 2 years. I ran the creative writing club in high school. I took a semester course in college and then a longer capstone course for an entire year in college. I bought several courses that were part of the sort of extended education of my local university. So I did several courses just on my own, 6 weeks courses with that. I taught at creative writing summer camps. I've sought out a lot of opportunities to continue to critically think about creative writing and enhance my craft, and none of it compared to the 2 years that I had at my MFA program. I grew in leaps and bounds. It was absolutely spectacular how much I learned in that program. Part of it was that my MFA program, what I did was focusing on popular fiction, and nothing else that I had ever done previous to that was focused on genre fiction the way my MFA was. So while I learned a lot about general writing craft, I very specifically learned so much about conventions of genre fiction, conventions of fantasy, sci-fi, YA in those 2 years at my MFA program. And I'm so grateful. I would not be the writer I am today without my MFA program. I might eventually have gotten there, but certainly not in the time frame that I did. And now I can continue to grow as a writer and continue to have these really great best practices that I learned from my MFA program. So the hands down bottom line is, for me, it absolutely was worth it. But we're gonna weigh a little bit the benefits of my MFA versus the cost of my MFA, and you can come up and see sort of what comes out of that. So I already talked about community. Community is a huge benefit of my MFA. I adored the community. The great thing about an MFA community is that all of your peers are in a very similar place as you in terms of their desire to learn and to improve their craft. And all the alumni are always often very excited to continue to interact with people that went to their MFA program, and the faculty as well. The relationships you build with the faculty are relationships that you'll have with older mentors in the writing community for life, which is spectacular. spectacular, and I really enjoyed that aspect. Speaking of community, I have to show off, this is my Stormborn shirt. Stormborn was the name of my cohort. So the cohort that entered into the program in winter of 2018 and graduated together winter 2020. We were Stormborn. We came in on a massive blizzard. My residencies were in Maine because it was the University of Southern Maine. We came in on a massive blizzard. We also left on a massive blizzard. We were Stormborn, storm closed, and it was very cyclical and lovely. This is our Ice Phoenix. This is the design that we chose, that one of our PopFic peers drew for us and designed for us, which is really, really amazing. And then on the back, as you can see, we have our cohort, everyone's names, and that's that. I loved my cohort. I was our class representative. I got to speak at graduation as the class representative. And I was also the PopFic ambassador, so I got to be one of the people guiding new popular fiction students through that specialization. So obviously I was very involved in my MFA experience, and that's part of how you make community wherever you're making community, is just making sure to seek out opportunities to be involved as much as you can with your own sort of like mental health and mental fortitude when it comes to social interaction and things like that. Now that I'm an alumni of the Stone Coast program, I have that community that I can always fall back on, because once a Stone Coaster, always a Stone Coaster. But you can find community in a lot of places. So was the community just community? Is that benefit outweighing the cost? So the physical money I spent on my MFA was a lot of money that not everyone can afford, and I don't think if all I was getting out of an MFA was community of writers that the price would be worth it. I think you can find community in lots of different places. Talked a little bit about that in my querying, surviving the query trenches video. You can find communities on Twitter, you can find communities in local writing groups. There's many, many ways that you can seek out writing community that won't cost you, tens of thousands of dollars, right? However, as I talked about at the very beginning of this, the biggest benefit to getting your MFA is just stepping up your writing in such a condensed period of time. So for me, there's two things that I specifically struggled with previous to my MFA, even with all of my writing experience, all of the craft classes that I sought out, all of the ways that I was critically engaging with my own writing. There were 2/3 things that I really took away from my experience that I don't know how quickly I would have gotten otherwise. The first of those things was the way that I now interact critically with other authors' work and other pieces of entertainment. I definitely always was big into my English classes and always really enjoyed critically engaging with the work of other authors, but the way that my MFA program taught me to examine the craft of that author's work, the craft of other books, was way more useful than just engaging with the work in terms of the literature elements, so the literary elements. The way that my MFA program encouraged us to develop a cycle of seeking out books that are doing things similar to what we want to do in our own stories, critically engaging with those books, and then going back to our own pieces and seeing what we can do that is informed better by what already exists, is such a valuable lesson that I had heard of in terms of refilling your well, but it was a practical application of that lesson that is really, really good. And I'm really glad that I had those 2 years to sort of have that, practical application. And the other really cool thing that I learned, which I talked about even in my thesis for my MFA program, was how when I started my MFA, I knew that my number one weakness when it came to writing was characterization. It just was always something that I struggled with. I always struggled with figuring out who my characters were. And through the 2 years, without me even realizing it, through the 2 years that I worked on my writing at my MFA program, I went from believing that my characters were my weakest points of my novels to, in my final residency, I had workshops, and one of my peers started off her critique by saying, "Well, you obviously write character-driven stories." And I was like, I do. I never thought I wrote character-driven stories. I was never told I wrote character-driven stories, but suddenly, somehow, in the last 2 years of working on it, I went from having very shallow one-dimensional characters that were just used to further the plot, because what I cared about was the plotting and the world building. Suddenly, I had transitioned into fully fledged characters that used and moved within the plot in a much more dynamic way. And I don't know when that happened. I don't know how that happened, but something just clicked in my mind. And now I have heard over and over again from multiple people, from multiple critique partners, that characters are now a strong point, that I write character-driven stories in a way that I never did before. And that's spectacular. Character-driven stories are, you know, a more popular type of story because they make the most sense. It makes sense for the characters to be the driving force behind the plot. And I'm really glad that I kind of figured out how to, you know, make that mesh, that hybrid of really intense plotting and actual realistic and interesting and engaging characters. And that's something I don't know how quickly I ever would have stumbled across the secret to if I had not done my MFA program. And I'm gonna leave the final thing I learned for last. So let's go back to the cost side. One of the things I do wanna stress that is a cost to getting an MFA outside of the physical cost, the money, is the stress and the time you are spending on your MFA. It is graduate school. It is difficult. You are going to need to put in a lot of effort. And for me, I got my MFA in a low-res program where I was still working a full-time job. In fact, one of the semesters I was working 60 to 70 hours for my job on top of trying to be a full-time MFA student. And it was extremely stressful. There were many times where I just had a really hard time, and that was part of the issue of getting a low res and having to pay for it, is that I had to have a job and I had to, you know, be making money to live while doing school. And I had many peers who had kids at home that they had to take care of. That is its own level of stress. Luckily, I didn't have to deal with that. So, you know, there's factors to consider when it comes to getting your MFA and how much effort you're really willing to spend, because the amount of effort you put into it is going to equal the worth of it, right? So if you can really grind down and put in the time and the effort to really critically work on your writing in this intense 2-year program, then that's going to reward you with what I've talked about, these really amazing leaps in your actual craft. So that's something to consider. But I did have the, you know, ability, even though it was difficult at times, I was able to really buckle down and do what I needed to do and work on my craft and really think critically and to try to get out of it as much as I could. And the final thing that I learned, the final most important thing, I learned a lot of little things, so many little things. I could talk for ages, and maybe I will talk in future videos about some of the favorite classes that I took and some of the things I learned in those classes, in those seminars, and the things that my mentors taught me and things like that. But the biggest, most important thing my MFA program taught me how to do that I did not know how to do before my MFA program was revision. Revision is so difficult. Being able to take a story that you've poured so much effort into and strip it down to its bones and completely rewrite sections of it and work on developing better plots, better characters, better world beats, all of that is not an easy task. It's something that some people are a little better at. Some people have sort of that instinct to want to keep tweaking things over and over again, but there's a difference between copy editing and tweaking as there is with major developmental revision. And my MFA program taught me how to do major developmental revision, and that is a skill that you need if you want to be a traditionally published author, or even any type of published author. Being able to really take those big, really make those big changes to a story to make it better is just a really important skill to have. And that is something that my program was excellent about teaching me how to do. The story that I wrote as my thesis was revised 4 times as my thesis, and it's a better book now than it was when I first wrote it. And when I first wrote it, I did not know where to start. I looked at it, I knew that there were things I could fix, and I had some ideas for fixing it, but there was no real sense of accomplishment with the idea of revising it, because it felt like I had failed and I hadn't written the book that I wanted to write. And now I just have a completely different outlook on first drafts and how I go from a first draft to an end product that I really am proud of. And I'm just so grateful for my ability to revise. So yeah, in the end, for me, those things I learned, revision, characterization, and all of those little things about dialogue, things about world building, things about pacing, everything that I learned in my MFA, combined with the memories that I gained, combined with the community that I now have, that all very much outweighs the time, the stress, and the physical money that I spent on my MFA program. But that is a cost-benefit analysis that you have to make for yourself and decide if it is the right choice for you to seek out an MFA. For me, it was. I'd be happy to talk about more stuff about my MFA experience. It's something that I really adored, and I have a lot of stories that I could potentially share, and I am happy to give advice if you would like my advice on it. So please go ahead and comment down below, hit a like, subscribe, all of that stuff, and I look forward to chatting with y'all in the comments.